Manager fires pregnant woman, not knowing her husband's the new boss. Have you ever faced a situation where one moment of bad judgment could change everything? Imagine being fired from your job while you're already under pressure, only to discover later that the person who dismissed you isn't the only one in charge. What would you do if the very person you had no idea was tied to your fate was actually your husband's boss? This is the story of Emily Parker, a young, hard-working woman who's pregnant and already feeling the weight of life. Little does she know, her life is about to take an unexpected turn after a single encounter with her manager, Brian King. The sun streams through the glass windows of the office building, casting warm light over the cubicles of Parker and Company, a thriving marketing firm in the heart of the city. The hustle and bustle of the business world is felt in every corner, from the click-clack of keyboards to the murmur of phone calls and the ever-present hum of the copy machine. It's a place where careers are made and where secrets are buried in the daily grind. Emily Parker, though young, had worked hard to get where she was. She had spent years climbing the ladder at Parker and Company, her sharp mind and dedication making her a standout in the marketing department. But lately, things had become increasingly difficult. She was pregnant with her first child, a dream she had long held close to her heart. But with that came new challenges, long hours, tiring work, and growing discomfort. She knew she had to tough it out, but the exhaustion was catching up with her. Her boss, Brian King, a man known for his rigid approach to work and little empathy, had already been difficult to work with. He expected perfection at all times and had little patience for personal matters, especially when it came to employees like Emily. One afternoon, Emily entered Brian's office with a smile, ready to present her latest marketing proposal. She hoped this would be the project that would finally win her the promotion she had worked for. But the moment she stepped inside, the cold, dismissive look on Brian's face told her everything she needed to know. Without greeting her, Brian gestured for Emily to sit. His tone was sharp. "Emily, I've been reviewing your performance and frankly, it's not what I expect from someone in your position. You've been distracted lately, and I've noticed a drop in your efficiency." Emily, surprised by the sudden criticism, tried to explain herself. "Brian, I've been working hard. I know things have been difficult, but I'm doing my best. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Enough. This isn't a daycare. If you can't keep up with the demands of the job, then maybe it's time for you to move on." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Brian didn't hesitate. "You're fired. I'm sorry, but this just isn't working anymore." Emily stood there, frozen in disbelief. The words rang in her ears, but she couldn't process them. Fired? She had never imagined this could happen to her, especially now, with a baby on the way. "Brian, I've given so much to this company," Emily said, trying to regain some composure. "I've always put in my best effort. You can't just fire me like this." But Brian was already packing up his things, not bothering to look up at her. "I've made my decision. It's final." As Emily left the office, she felt a sense of hopelessness wash over her. She had just lost her job, one of the few things that had kept her going through the pregnancy. Her mind raced as she thought of how she would tell her husband, Tom, who was already under a lot of stress at work himself. What Emily didn't know, however, was that Tom had recently been promoted to a senior executive position at Parker and Company, a fact she had learned only a few days prior. He had mentioned it casually over dinner, but the conversation hadn't sunk in until later. She called him as soon as she was outside the building. Her voice wavered with emotion as she told him what had just happened. "Tom, I don't know what to do. Brian just fired me and I don't understand why." There was a brief silence on the other end before Tom responded, his tone serious. "Emily, you need to come home right now. We're going to fix this." After the abrupt firing, Emily walked out of Brian's office in a daze, her heart pounding in her chest. Her hands shook as she dialed her husband, Tom. As the phone rang, she could hardly believe what had just happened. Fired just like that. She had always prided herself on her dedication, her work ethic, her loyalty to the company. Now, all of that seemed meaningless. "Tom, it's done," she said, her voice shaky when he finally answered. "Brian fired me. He said I wasn't performing well, but that's not true. I've been working my hardest, I swear. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Emily could feel Tom's frustration growing. "Wait, hold on," Tom said, his voice tight with anger. "Brian, that's insane, Emily. You've been doing great work. I don't understand how this could happen. I'll deal with it. Just come home." The ride home was a blur, each passing minute making the reality of the situation feel more suffocating. When she arrived, Tom was already pacing back and forth in the living room. He had a look on his face, something between concern and raw anger. As Emily relayed the details of the conversation, Tom's eyes narrowed, a sense of disbelief washing over him. "Brian King," Tom muttered under his breath, rubbing his temples. "He's been at the company for years. He's always been so focused on climbing the corporate ladder, but I never imagined he'd do something like this. Why would he fire me? What did I do wrong?" Emily asked, trying to make sense of the chaos in her mind. "I didn't even get a chance to explain. He just dismissed me without hearing my side." "I'll tell you why," Tom said, the frustration in his voice rising. "I think he's been taking advantage of his position, and now that he has the power, he's acting like it. But what he doesn't realize is that I'm his boss now. I've been promoted to senior VP, Emily. I didn't want to bring it up yet, but now's the time." The revelation hit Emily like a slap to the face. Her husband, the one who had always worked tirelessly to get ahead, was now Brian's superior. It was almost too surreal to grasp. All this time, Brian had been Emily's manager, and yet he had no idea who Tom really was. He hadn't known that Tom was the person whose decisions could now directly affect his future. "You mean Brian fired me not knowing that you're his boss?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom nodded grimly. He didn't know, and now he's about to learn just how wrong he was. As the truth sank in, Emily's anger boiled over. The idea that Brian had dismissed her so easily, with no regard for her hard work or the fact that she was pregnant, was unbearable. Tom's face grew stern as he picked up his phone, making a call to the HR department. "I'm going to handle this, Emily. You're not going to be treated this way. I'll make sure of it," Tom said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "Brian's going to have to answer for this." Emily could feel the injustice of it all weighing on her, how she had been so quickly discarded because of assumptions, without even the slightest bit of empathy. It stung deeply. She had fought so hard to prove herself, to rise above the challenges, only to be told that her efforts weren't enough. But what made it even worse was that Brian had acted out of his own insecurities and ambition, without understanding the full scope of his actions. He had no idea what he was about to unleash. The next day, Emily and Tom arrived at the office together. Emily was still in shock, trying to wrap her head around what had happened. Tom's demeanor was calm, but the tension in the air was palpable. He had already scheduled a meeting with HR, and now it was time for him to face Brian. They walked into the conference room where Brian was already waiting. His face lit up when he saw Tom, but it quickly faltered when he noticed Emily standing behind him. She had insisted on being there, despite Tom's initial hesitation. This wasn't just about her job, it was about holding Brian accountable. Brian stood up, a nervous laugh escaping his lips. "Tom, I didn't expect to see you here. I didn't realize we were doing a meeting today." Tom didn't smile. His tone was icy. "Well, Brian, it seems we have a lot to discuss. I'm sure you're aware of the situation with my wife." Brian's smile faltered, and Emily saw the first hint of unease in his eyes. Of course," he said, his voice slightly too high-pitched. I made a mistake. Emily, I didn't mean to offend you. It's just the workload, and I thought—" "You thought?" Tom interrupted, his voice sharp. "Brian, I think you forgot one crucial detail. My wife has been working hard for this company. She's been doing everything you asked of her, and you fired her, just like that." Brian's eyes darted between Tom and Emily, confusion clouding his face. But she's not performing. She's pregnant. She won't be able to handle the demands of the job. I thought it was better to— You thought? Tom's voice had turned dangerous now. Let me tell you something, Brian. You have no idea who you've been working for. I've been promoted to senior vice president of this company. And you? You're about to learn just how wrong you were. The room went silent. The weight of Tom's words hit Brian like a ton of bricks. His face drained of color. Wait, you're— What? Brian stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Senior VP, Tom repeated, his voice steady. Which means, I'm your boss now, Brian, and I don't tolerate this kind of behavior. You've shown a complete lack of respect for my wife. Not only that, but your actions have endangered your position here. Brian opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He was paralyzed by the shock of the revelation. Emily watched, a small sense of satisfaction settling over her. Brian had underestimated them both. He had dismissed her, thoughtlessly believing he could push her aside without any consequences. But now he was facing the full brunt of his own arrogance. I think it's time for you to reassess your priorities, Brian, Tom said, his voice cold. I'm going to make sure this is dealt with. And you? Well, let's just say you'll be lucky if you're still employed after today. The silence in the room was deafening, as Brian's mind raced to process the bombshell that had just dropped. Emily, still stunned by the twist of fate, finally allowed herself to breathe. The injustice was being corrected, and it felt good. The following days at the office were tense. Emily had returned to her desk, though her confidence had been shaken. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next. But Tom's words hung in the air like a promise, and she felt a glimmer of hope for the first time since Brian had fired her. Tom wasted no time in addressing the situation. After the meeting with Brian, he had taken the matter straight to HR and initiated a formal investigation. The company was large, and Brian was one of the higher-ups, but Tom's new position as senior VP carried weight. He quickly made it clear that the culture of favoritism and discrimination under Brian's leadership would no longer be tolerated. As the days passed, Brian's behavior became more erratic. His once commanding presence in the office had diminished as the investigation into his actions unfolded. Emily watched as the HR department carefully documented his past decisions, including his treatment of her and the other employees under his supervision. Word of the investigation began to spread, and employees, many of whom had been too afraid to speak up before, began to come forward with their own stories of Brian's toxic behavior. Finally, the inevitable happened. Emily received a meeting request from HR. She walked in with Tom by her side, the weight of the moment not lost on her. The HR manager, a stern woman named Linda, was sitting behind her desk with a solemn expression. Emily, Tom, Linda began, her voice steady. After a thorough review of the situation and several complaints from other employees, it's clear that Brian's actions were not just unethical but against company policy. He has been let go from his position as manager, effective immediately. A sense of relief washed over Emily, and she saw Tom's subtle nod of approval. It was done. Brian, who had thought he was untouchable, was now out of the company. His treatment of Emily, his disregard for her as a person and an employee, had cost him everything. Emily, Linda continued, I'm truly sorry for what you've had to go through. As a company, we pride ourselves on creating a fair and respectful environment. Brian's actions were a violation of those values, and we are committed to making this right. We'll also be offering you full paid maternity leave, starting immediately. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but this time they were not tears of frustration. They were tears of gratitude. For the first time, she felt recognized, respected, and valued. The company had not only righted the wrongs, but had also taken steps to ensure that nothing like this would happen again. As she left the meeting with Tom, Emily took a deep breath. Justice had been served. Brian's arrogance and cruelty had finally caught up with him, and she was walking out of the office with her dignity intact and her future bright. The long days of struggle had led her to this moment, a moment where fairness and integrity had triumphed over arrogance and injustice. And though there was still a long road ahead, both for Emily and Tom, she knew one thing for certain: sometimes the truth really does set you free. The story of Emily and Brian serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even in the face of adversity. It shows us that no matter how powerful or untouchable someone may seem, integrity and fairness always have a way of prevailing. When Brian fired Emily without considering her worth, her needs, or the injustices she faced, he believed that his authority and position would shield him from consequences. But what he didn't realize was that the truth, when brought into the light, is a force that can tear down even the tallest walls. Emily, despite her fears and doubts, refused to let the injustice continue unchecked. She remained strong, relying on the support of others and the knowledge that her rights mattered. This story also highlights the significance of having allies who recognize when something is wrong and are willing to take action. Tom, in his new role, could have easily ignored Emily's plight, but instead, he chose to use his position to right a wrong. By doing so, he not only brought justice for Emily, but also set a standard for others in the company to follow. His actions remind us that one person's decision can change the lives of many. The moral here is clear: no one should ever be made to feel small or insignificant, especially when it comes to their dignity and rights. And in a world where power dynamics often seem skewed, it's essential to remember that karma always has a way of catching up to those who abuse their position. Justice may take time, but it is always worth the wait. In the end, standing up for yourself and supporting others in their struggles can lead to a world where fairness triumphs, and people can thrive without fear of exploitation or mistreatment.